Oh no, I don't think it's a great thing to be there at all by any stretch of the imagination. I think the sooner they resolve it, but unfortunately there seems to be no pressure for it because, yeah, it will be a safety concern at some stage, and I suppose unfortunately does someone have to get injured before they do something about it, because at the moment they're doing nothing about it and haven't done for quite some time.
Police want to talk to 4 young people seen going into a derelict historic building shortly before it caught fire in Wellington over the weekend. While the Tamatha building is at the centre of a long-running wrangle between its owners and the council over quake strengthening, the blaze has also highlighted a nationwide issue.
The thing that's so disappointing is I think it's an avoidable and preventable situation in that it's a building that's been left abandoned to rot, to decay. It's been unoccupied for years and years.
The owner received consent to strengthen the building last year, but didn't agree with the council on restoring some features due to the cost involved.
I've always said that Wellington is like super obsessed with like this concept of heritage. Once something is heritage protected, it is almost untouchable. And I think that's a problem because our city is not a museum. There's a housing crisis, and that heritage listing and that kind of stuff gets in the way. Like starting with heritage, I think that the concept itself and what is deemed to be heritage and what isn't deemed to be heritage is arbitrary. It's really hard to pinpoint what heritage is and whose heritage we're talking about.
And usually what happens is that there is an examination of why that building is heritage. Does it have particular architectural style? Is it built by a famous architect? Does it have amazing stories behind it? There's all these things that come to bear, and if those things aren't particularly special, then I think you can argue that that we don't need that building anymore.
The things that often raise the eyebrows of the public are things like building condition. That's not a factor in what we consider in terms of whether or not a place is significant.
There's not like a clear process about this is heritage and this isn't, or this is this and this, it's really random. I think heritage is kind of a bit of an ambiguous term and concept, and it is kind of decided by whoever has the power to decide it, whether that's the council of the time or Heritage New Zealand and whoever sits on their board and whoever determines and decides that. It's kind of depends on the legislation at the time or the policy at the time, but it is a pretty ambiguous concept, and I think when it's being used in New Zealand it's often referring to Pākehā heritage, just to be totally put that out there at the front.
Aesthetic value is something that's quite subjective, and so there are a lot of buildings out there that would not be to one's personal taste necessarily, and one wonders why they might have heritage status, but they can be aesthetically pleasing to other people, and moreover it's about all of those values that the place encompasses. So even if it's not a particularly attractive building or structure or complex of buildings, it has nevertheless heritage values and significances that are worth recognising and preserving.
It's all, I think the kind of fundamental thing with all of this is that it's a decision that's made by human beings, and therefore it's not entirely consistent. But everyone would just naturally go, it's tied to time and history, but then you look at like a building is constructed as recently as the Wellington Central Library, which is built in the 2000s, and that's heritage protected because of the architect.
I think character brings a lot to the city. I think Wellington, for a start, just from a really maybe almost superficial point of view, often The images we see of Wellington in tourist brochures feature these old wooden houses on the hills. It's quite an iconic look of Wellington. So that's part of what makes Wellington special. They also tell stories. They are a record of our history.
A lot of people say we need to protect them because it's an important time in our history. We can do that through historical protection. We don't have to do that through character protection.
And it also actually encourages walkability, which takes a bit of explaining, but when you walk along a street, the more that a street is interesting and has front-facing houses that have a lot of interest for you to engage with, the more your walk is enjoyable, which I don't know, maybe sounds a little bit strange, but these suburbs and these streets are really walkable.
At the train station, we wanted to put in a accessibility ramp so that people in wheelchairs could get into the train station. And we weren't able to do anything on it because it was like a heritage staircase. Like, what's a heritage staircase? And then there's heritage cranes on the waterfront. Like, there's heritage everything. And I think that's a problem because our city is not a museum.
Preservation of heritage is important nationally as it is internationally. And Wellington is no exception to that. Generally speaking, there are good social and economic arguments for the retention of heritage, which are over and above the simple preservation of historic value and aesthetic value that heritage buildings can bring to the environment.
Some people love heritage and they don't want to see any of it change, and obviously other people have different views, and it's just something we have to ideally debate as a society and think, what do we value the most?
For me, that's a walkable city, an affordable city, a climate-resistant city. Protecting the way that a city looks is far further down that list for me.
The retention of our historic heritage buildings and structures provides a tangible link with our past. It creates a sense of identity and a sense of place and a sense of belonging and pride within the community, which is really important.
There's a lot of romanticisation of the past, but the past and what we currently have is not fit to equip ourselves for who should live here, because people need to live in cities because cities are where opportunity is concentrated. Yeah, they're just not museums.
I certainly think that the advocacy groups that advocate for retaining 1930s character areas get in the way of creating a city that is for people, where people can access everything that they need at an affordable price. It's the main thing getting in the way of a city that I want to live in, a city that many renters want to live in. It's just so unnecessary when we have 20,000 people that are going to be looking for homes in Wellington and there's no homes to provide them at the moment. It's just insane to me that anyone could weight that conversation in the favour of houses that don't serve our community.
It's also identifiable for people coming from out of town or overseas. There are aspects of Wellington's built heritage that are unique to it, just as there are aspects of built heritage in other places that are unique to those places.
I don't think it has to be this. It's either heritage and character or we have housing. We can do both those things, and the evidence is there that there is capacity for new housing in areas at the moment that just isn't being built.
And I think something that people who want to protect these pre-1930s homes continue to think is that every single pre-1930s home that builds the character in a character area should be treated like a historically significant home. And at the end of the day, they're just not that significant.
So my name's Laura Drew. I'm one of the tenancy lawyers at Community Law Wellington and Hutt Valley. I joke that I battle landlords, but yeah, we help tenants, usually with issues with their landlords, but often with their co-tenants or flatmates. We just provide free legal advice. Often that means representing people in the tenancy tribunal. Heritage New Zealand, they've got a lot of racism in what they kind of classify as worthy of preserving. Like, why preserve colonial, heritage when people are homeless? And why not just return those houses to mana whenua?
Ultimately, character protection is, by and large, protecting Western areas of the city. We don't see the same protection being extended to areas of Māori cultural heritage.
Maybe starting with looking at colonisation, the effects of colonisation in Aotearoa and addressing those. Return the land, If the foundation of the state is injustice, then that's the kind of society we're going to build. So land back.
I think it's factually incorrect to say that protecting the look of our streets is contributing to the well-being of our city when we haven't protected the character and the look of the Māori cultural significant areas in our city, which have led to people both moving out of the city to find housing elsewhere and being disconnected from the whenua that they grew up on, but also seeing the whenua that they grew up on being absolutely transformed in a way that doesn't look like their home anymore, has no resemblance to their history.
Buildings that have been closed and left derelict for long periods of time in other parts of the city are ones that you might identify as being problematic as well. A lot of those are unreinforced masonry buildings that require strengthening, and so therefore they require a large investment and they have reluctant building owners. The Gordon Wilson Flats is one very high profile building. It's a very high profile example of that, and it's quite controversial.
Gordon Wilson's like a great example of a building that could be used to house students or renters or workers or anyone really that's like crying out for housing. It's on the terrace, which is like walkable, you could walk anywhere you need to go in town. It's heritage protected, and it's heritage protected because of the type of architecture it was and what it represents and how that architecture was like modern for its time.
That's an example of a building that is not to everyone's aesthetic taste by any means, and of course that's not enhanced in any way by the condition that it is in at the moment.
It's a really poor use of the space that could be something so much better, and just kind of illustrates that kind of ambiguous or random nature of heritage listing.
But we also in Wellington have a number of historical buildings which aren't historically protected, especially around the Tory Street area, which were buildings of cultural significance to Chinese immigrants. They were buildings where they came together as a community. They're now kind of just different workshops, but you can still see the original names on the buildings. I think those buildings do speak to the history of Aotearoa and New Zealand and the different cultures that use them and the way they use them, the way communities formed.
And we've certainly had examples in the past of buildings that have been seen as problematic, or they have divided communities very strongly. The Erskine College demolition in Island Bay is one of those, and in my opinion, a huge travesty to have lost that building. Massive, massive, massive mistake. Its protection was seen ultimately as getting in the way of being able to develop that site. And it was actually subject to a heritage order, which is a legislative mechanism that is not often used in New Zealand. It remains available to be used, but it's not often used. The reason why we haven't got to that point with a substantial number of other buildings will partially be economic. So it's decisions either by council or more likely by building owners not to take court action, because that takes time and also chews up a lot of resource. In the case of Erskine, it had a developer with an awful lot of financial backing.
The caveat is that just because you knock something down doesn't mean you get a good thing in its place. There's plenty of examples of where something was knocked down and people anticipated something good would come and it didn't necessarily occur. A really interesting example is the Paddington Apartments. That's a prime site on Taranaki Street, and people expected that would be a high-rise development, but in fact the developers, for various reasons, and I understand it's because of what's affordable to build and what the market wanted, they didn't want body corp arrangements, built small townhouses 1 or 2 stories high, and that's probably an underuse of that land, but that's what happens when developers get to make the calls.
A lot of the time, the owners of these heritage houses, the really poor quality ones, they're not living in them. They're living in their nice, up-to-date, refurbished heritage house elsewhere, but we are the ones that have to live in these houses.
The council has the role of deeming whether buildings are safe to inhabit or not, and then the owner has the job of refurbishing them or not. And if they're not willing to do that, I think, in my view, there should be some way for the council or some other entity to have the ability to remove that building from the owners and get that work done.
Lots of people come up to us that say they're good landlords, and when you really dive into what it means to them to be a good landlord, it just means providing a house and not really bothering the tenant. It not only pisses me off, it weighs on my mind every single day. If you're a negligent landlord that isn't maintaining your home, the simple message I have for you is that you shouldn't be a landlord. You never have provided rental housing. Builders provide housing. Architects design housing. You just provide the service of collecting a paycheck.
My message to negligent landlords of Wellington is that your time is like running out. And renters like myself are now in positions where we can have influence over you and the profit that you make off of us living in your crappy housing. So watch out. That's all I'd say to them.
The next time there is extra regulation about making a home healthy, if you can't provide a healthy home, sell it.
I don't think one message can kind of build the kind of empathy that some people need. Yeah. Just imagine if it was your children or you in that position. Yeah, the things we see is pretty heartbreaking. Yeah.
Our council has taken a turn. We've broken away from history and we have tried to be more permissive of building new houses and actually just saying, if a house is there, who cares when it was built? If it's sitting there, it's empty or it's derelict, people are living in it, demolish it. Build new housing, build more housing, and then we'll be, closer to being able to provide all the housing that people need.
Sometimes a livable city benefits from having old houses and buildings in it. A livable city does not benefit from having buildings that are just shuttered up. So decisions have to be made about the future of those buildings somehow or other, otherwise they just sit there.